I would like to begin this episode by acknowledging that I am located in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, and I am privileged and honored to live and learn on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishnaabeg Algonquin Nation.
Hello, you're listening to Trench Leadership, a podcast from the front, produced by iGlen Studios, a show for emerging leaders from all professions. To hear from other leaders who have led from the front, made the mistakes, had the triumphs, and are still learning along the way. And now, here's your host, Simon Cardinal.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Trench Leadership, a podcast from the front. Critical thinking is a skill that comes easier to some people more than others. The good news is that critical thinking skills can be taught. And this is great news because a robust critical thinking capacity is essential for leaders. And so in this episode, you'll hear from Dr. Steve Pearlman, founder of the Critical Thinking Institute, author, and fellow podcast host. Steve will offer his definition of critical thinking while also providing advice and practical tips to help all of us be the best critical thinkers we can be. But as always, it's not about me, it's about the guest. So I'm going to try and be quiet and introduce Steve. Hey, Steve, how's it going?
It's going great. Thanks so much for having me on. I really look forward to this interview.
Oh, this is going to be, I feel, a very strong interview for a couple of reasons. First of all, you're a fellow podcast host, so you kind of understand the flavor and the vibe of how things go. But also, critical thinking is one of those things that is important for everyone. And everyone knows it, but very few people actually have the skill sets to go ahead and do it if they don't just have the abilities intuitively. So for a new leader, it's so important to know how to be able to lead your teams and enact ultimately what the organization wants us to do. But before we get into that, I'm wondering, do you mind just taking a moment and telling us a bit about yourself and ultimately how we got to this point?
Sure. Yeah. I was in academia for 30 years. My doctoral degree is in composition theory. And I started as a writing instructor. And my emphasis in writing instruction was on critical thinking, which is not necessarily where everyone focuses on, which I think is a little surprising. But nevertheless, that's where my emphasis was. And early in my career, I realized that I was completely unsuccessful at doing anything to move the needle for my students' critical thinking, and had to take a hard look at what I was doing and start to refine my practices based on research and so forth. But there actually was not a lot of research 30 years ago on actual transformation and critical thinking, and there's still not enough now. But over that journey, eventually I got good enough at it and knew enough about it where a university asked me to raise critical thinking outcomes across an entire university, from first-year students through PhD students in every discipline on the campus. Now, that seems like it should be something that's pretty obvious for universities to do, except there's really no evidence that universities raise critical thinking outcomes for their students, which is absolutely horrific. And some of the research is actually that it gets a little worse as students get higher up in their grade levels, unfortunately. So it never really been done before. There are a couple of universities and colleges who are making some efforts at it with some success, but collectively speaking, this hadn't been done. So I had to look at all the research and form entirely new methodologies for teaching and understanding critical thinking such that also we could demonstrate results with it, which is another one of the big problems with critical thinking discussions and research. Very often they're done by people who haven't had to prove results, which I did. And so we were able to do that for the campus. And basically we're able to get first-year students doing writing that was like graduate students in just a short period of time. So we achieved some great things. But then I realized, you know what, I'm never going to reach enough people through education. I've got to be able to reach people directly. And that's why I founded the Critical Thinking Institute.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I think it's kind of interesting. You had touched on it really quick in that critical thinking is obvious. And I think it's one of those things that is so obvious, everyone just assumed that we were all going to do it. And my experiences have been that when someone goes and does a higher level education course of some type, that course is the thing that is giving someone critical thinking skills. Not necessarily. Does that make sense at all?
It's not necessarily true at all. And it's not based on my opinion, but based on a lot of research. The majority of education doesn't teach critical thinking. It doesn't try to. Most of it's based on memorization more than anything else. And then the other research shows us, I won't go into all the details unless you really want the nitty gritty, but most of the tactics that educators are using with absolutely the best of intentions. And I want to make it very clear, we have to support educators, not condemn them. We're looking at a systemic problem, not the fault of any individual educators, but the pedagogies that most educators use to teach critical thinking have been shown not to develop critical thinking skills. They're not contrary to them necessarily, but they're not doing what we think they're doing. And so, yeah, there's no real support from most education doing anything for critical thinking at all.
Well, that's an interesting point you're bringing up about that. I know for myself, when I'm trying to ensure that I'm thinking about something from a critical perspective, I can usually tell if I'm doing it or not, because if I'm asking myself questions, I find that when I'm going over some paperwork or whatnot, that's kind of a cue for myself telling me that I am thinking about something from a more critical perspective. But more often than not, I'm digesting the information. When I went through my graduate degree, it was about bring the information in, write a couple of papers about it, move on to the next thing. And quite often there was a bit of a flush dump happening. And what do I do with that information? Do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Well, so here's the problem, right? I can't speak to your particular work individually, right? But let's say, for example, that we teach people how to make an argument, and we consider that teaching critical thinking. Okay, now in a certain respect, that's a good skill to have, because we do all need to know how to make a good argument for things. We want to be persuasive, we want to take a stance, and so forth. In some ways, though, that's been shown to actually shut down the critical thinking process, because we are biased individuals. We have what's called belief perseverance, which is the desire to keep thinking what we already believe, as well as some other cognitive biases, such as confirmation bias, which makes us tend to see that what we're seeing is true if it agrees with us. And if it doesn't agree with us, then we think it's not true, even if it's the same kind of information. So teaching people argumentation can actually suppress important aspects of critical thinking, believe it or not, instead of supporting them. And that's kind of where we find ourselves in critical thinking. The other problem is that our brains have sort of two sides to them. And one side does things that are good critical thinking habits, but we also have baked into our brains for survival reasons, bad critical thinking habits. And it seems like that doesn't make any sense, but it's nevertheless the case. And those two are often fighting each other. So for example, baked into our brains is a tendency to be tribalistic. And we did this because if we were able to form tribes, we were better able to survive than being out there on our own. And that's really hardwired into us. But once we start to form a little group, a little tribe, we start to see the other tribe as the enemy, or other ideas as problematic if they're outside of our tribal ideas. That doesn't make our tribal ideas right. And it doesn't make us good critical thinkers, because we're excluding these other tribal ideas just because they're not ours. So it actually gets in the way with it. So it's good for survival in certain respects. It's not necessarily good for critical thinking in the modern age in the same way that we need to do it now.
Well, and look at the divides that exist within politics, and the tactics that all political sides are using to sow that sense of fear and hatred against the other, because their ideas are different, not wrong, just different. And I'm not getting into any type of political debate, I promise you, but that's just the first thought that came to my mind about that. It's interesting how it's used as a tactic.
Yeah, in fact, we're inclined to see different ideas as problematic. And the reason is that our brains, everyone's brains, see whatever ideas that we already have as good ideas because we're alive. And if we're alive with the beliefs that we have, then those beliefs must be contributing to keeping us alive, to helping us survive, right? That's not necessarily true. Some of our beliefs could be completely wrong or even dangerous for us, but that's sort of not really how our brain sees them at a deep level. And this is very interesting as well. In terms of criticism, we know that there are two thinking systems for the brain. These are made famous by Daniel Kahneman, but they were known long before him. But there's system one and there's system two. System one is fast and instinctive, and system two is slow critical thinking. Okay? We know that criticism of other people probably emerges more from system one, which means that the tendency to critique is an instinctive reaction rather than a thoughtful reaction. And it's instinctive because it makes us feel right. And as we feel right, we feel good about ourselves and our tribe and our chances for survival. But that doesn't mean that we are right. It only means that we have an instinct to actually be critical of other ideas. That's not a healthy instinct. That's a very dangerous instinct.
Oh, absolutely. And I think you touched on the point there that critical thinking takes time. Before we started recording here, we were talking about how information is so easy to find. And I'd like to point out what I said was information is easy to find. It's not necessarily the right information or true information. You go into Google or whatever the search drive someone is using, and whatever pops up first tends to be what people will find as the right information and then drive with that. But that quick grasp of information is not thinking about something critically. Depends what you're looking for. Does that make sense at all?
It makes great sense. And I have two comments on that. The first is I'd really encourage people not to get news information from social media. No matter which, I don't care which side of politics or what you're looking at. The problem is that the algorithms that they use to deliver those informations to you actually are skewed, because they try to give you stuff that agrees with you because you're more likely to look at it than stuff that disagrees with you. So it kind of puts you in an echo chamber. And that's not healthy for anybody if we really want to think critically. So that's one problem with it. The second problem with it, for an example, we're overwhelmed by it. I did some work with the United States Air Force. And one of the things that they made clear was that in terms of finding data analysts who are able to look at intelligence, gather intelligence and so forth, and make strategic decisions and so forth. The problem a few years ago was that they couldn't get enough intelligence. It was the acquisition of information that was the challenge. Now they have more information than they've ever had, more than they know what to do with, but they can't find people who are adept at critically thinking through that intelligence in order to be able to make effective decisions down the road.
Well, that's interesting how that shift has happened. I know for myself, I'm okay with looking at information and taking it in so long as I have plenty of time and I don't feel pressured to get some type of assessment out quickly. If I do, then it's not my strength. I'm really good at taking that time. But I would imagine in those intelligence environments, they want the information quickly brought out and collated down to a bite-sized chunk.
It depends on the circumstance. I mean, sometimes they have more time than others. Sometimes quick decisions have to be made if things are happening fast, and sometimes you're looking at more long-term global questions. So it really depends. But what's important is that it's the same skill either way, and we just don't have people who are being trained in that skill enough, which is really what my specialty is.
That's amazing, and to be able to help people draw that out from an emerging leader perspective. It's quite often people are brought into these roles not because of their proven leadership skill set. It's because they've proven themselves to be the most amazing technical person on the team. And that creates its whole other way of doing things, because now there's a shift in the roles. Now all of a sudden your role is not just to focus on what you were doing, but to look at the broader picture. And that requires that critical skill thinking set to be able to do that and then go forth and help the organization and the team succeed. It's tough. Do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Well, I would ask any leaders or potential leaders, emerging leaders who are listening to this, to ask themselves, is there anything that is more valuable to you and to your team than the ability to think critically, right? What's going to determine your success as a leader, and what's going to determine your success of your team more than how well everyone can think and think well together, right? I can think of nothing that's going to make a difference in that more than critical thinking. And then ask yourself whether or not you've really been formally trained in how to think critically and whether or not your team has. And let me give you an example of where there's so many things that teams run into that are problems that are so easily addressed if we know how to do it. One example is that, as I talked about, we're tribal in nature. So let's say you go out to a team and you say, well, everyone, I want to hear everyone's idea about what we should do about this problem, or what the problem is, or whatever the question is. And you go around the room, you go around the circle, and everyone sort of talks about what their idea is. Well, what we know is that the early ideas suppress most of the later ideas, especially since as soon as one person number 3, says that they thought person number 1's idea was great, now person number 4 is less likely to voice their own independent idea. So we make a slight shift in that, because now they've started to build a tribe, right? Already. A tribe started to form. We don't want to be on the outskirts of that tribe. It's dangerous for us, right? And especially if number 4 and 5 say number 1's idea is great, what do you think number 6 is going to say? I think number 1's idea is terrible. No, it's not going to happen. So early ideas get preference in these meetings. What if instead everybody had to write down their idea And everybody had to hand their idea to the person next to them. They had to read the idea and they had to say one thing that was good about it before talking about anybody else's idea. Now, at least at the minimum, and there are lots of other things that we need to do like that, but now at least at the very minimum, we have an equal forum for all the initial ideas to reach the floor. And then we have to deal with other ways about how to bring those out and contend with them fairly in critical thinking ways. But that's just an example of how some of the things we do as leaders with the best of intentions, right? Because we want to hear from all of our constituents. We want to get all the stakeholders involved and we want to get different ideas out on the table. And our intentions are earnest, but our process is actually terribly flawed from a cognitive perspective. These are the things that we need to work with leaders to understand better so that they can be more valued as leaders and they can be more successful as leaders.
Well, it's interesting you talk about that because I agree. I'll start by saying I completely agree with you. And by everyone, as you, in your example, everyone taking their notes and shifting them to the right or to the left or whatever, it gets rid of some of that hierarchy. Because quite often, how many times have we seen it in a meeting when the CEO or whoever's leading the thing gets up and says, "Well, I think this is my idea." How many people, more often than not, are going to disagree? It's pretty rare. And now everything's been skewed because, like you said, people want to be part of that tribe, part of that team.
Yeah, especially if a leader, especially if a CEO or just, an executive is there, it's not an equal playing field anymore, right? So that leader really has to shut up and first hear the other ideas before voicing their own and not participate, but let other people start to develop an idea, or at least let the team meet first, come to a collective team idea, then bring it to the leader with a rationale. And we talk about that as well. But, that's kind of the way to start leveling these out so that ideas get air when they otherwise would be suffocated, right? And it doesn't make those ideas mean that any one of them is individually right, but collectively we start to move a process that gets us to better and better thinking as an organization.
Oh yeah, absolutely. As I was getting ready for this episode, I was going along and I was saying, well, I wonder what definitions of leadership might be. So I went to Google, and interestingly enough, the Cambridge University's definition of critical thinking is the process of thinking carefully about a subject or idea without allowing feelings or opinions to affect you. And I really enjoyed the part, and there was, of course, many different definitions that float around in there, but I selected that one because I really like the idea of how it brought up that it's without feelings or emotions. That sounds great when you're reading it on a Google link, but the reality of it is that is very, very difficult to do. I'm curious, two things, what you think about that definition, and then maybe you could offer your definition of critical thinking.
Sure. So this is one of the things we talk about in our program a lot, but that definition's fine and it's terrible. And let me tell you what I mean by that, okay? In certain respects, we got to put critical thinking into words, right? But we run into a word salad all the time with it, and people try to throw more words at it. First of all, with that definition, it's impossible to think without emotion, okay? It's not possible. No one's ever going to do it. We think emotionally before we think intellectually. In fact, our brains operate that way. So no one can do that. But also, what does carefully mean? Can you identify when someone's thinking carefully or not thinking carefully? You really can't, right? So that's a problem. So all definitions that we run into with critical thinking, most people try to throw more words at them to clarify, well, it's being analytical, we're evaluating, we're doing all these other things. They throw lots of words at it, being objective and so on and so forth. They all break down. Let me try to help you think about critical thinking in a different way. The way we conceptualize critical thinking is understanding the functions that your brain does whenever it encounters any kind of problem or idea or what have you, and mastering those brain functions so as to maximize the good functions that your brain naturally wants to do and minimize the negative functions that your brain also wants to do. So I don't think of critical thinking in terms of being objective or doing any of these things. I think of it as we call it metacognition, understanding our thinking. We think about it, understanding literally what the brain is trying to do when it thinks, what mechanisms are in place and how it functions, and mastering that brain function rather than thinking about it as this sort of abstract series of terms.
And that I really like that your definition of that, in that it's not explaining what critical thinking is, but it's more about understanding the concept of critical thinking, because that's the big thing about this. Is I think most of us have seen people that we perceive to be good in a crisis or in some type of highly emotionally charged moment. And quite often I feel that those examples, and from a military perspective, the type of leaders we're looking for in those moments are not the one that we kind of perceive running around with their hair on fire, running or throwing out orders and decisions just to get something out there. Rather, we're looking for that person who's going to maybe take that extra second, take a breath, consider everything, think about what's going on, and then develop a plan and go forward with that. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah. So there are two different ways to think about it, right? And you're right on the mark. There are times where we don't have time to think through a decision. All of a sudden we're under fire. We don't have time to sit back and think about what we should do necessarily. We've got to act, right? And so at that point, what we hope is that we've trained that person well enough and thought through decision trees fast enough and well enough with them so that whatever the decision they make, though they might make it in a split second, is the product of lots of critical thinking that had gone before it and training that had gone before it. On the other hand, here's the big problem that you identified, which is that most people will tend to use system 1 thinking, the fast instinctive thinking, when they should be using system 2. The brain, in fact, and this is not a criticism of people, this is a natural instinct of our brains. This is one of the things that we have to train people not to do. Our brains are inclined to want to go to the fast path to get to an answer quick, to feel right and feel done and safe, than they are to want to think things through. Some fascinating research was done on this, in fact. This is just absolutely amazing. Researchers tested people, and they gave them a question. The question had an easy answer or an obvious answer that was wrong, and it had a longer answer or a more distant answer, an inobvious question that was right. Two things were very interesting about this. The first thing was that most people took the wrong obvious answer instead of thinking through to the right answer, even though the answer was wrong and it was pretty obviously wrong, because everyone's brains wants to get to quick answers. That's how we survived in a lot of ways, but we're not in those situations anymore, okay? That's a mechanism for what to do if the bear suddenly jumps out at us, right? We're not facing those kinds of problems for the most part in our lives anymore. Our brains just don't know that. But here's the second thing that's much more interesting than that, because I think most people will understand, most people took the fast answer to the wrong answer, right? What's much more important and much more interesting is this. The brains that went for the wrong answer when it was obviously wrong and they knew there could be a right answer that took more work, they hesitated. They hesitated just a fraction of a second, but they hesitated, which wasn't the case when brains were given a fast answer that was in fact right. Those brains didn't hesitate. So in other words, somewhere baked into our brains, everyone's brains who's listening to me, is a desire to take that fast path, but your brains also know that sometimes they shouldn't take the fast path and they do it anyway. And we have to train our brains not to want to take that fast path, especially when they know it's wrong to do so.
That's interesting. I'm laughing about how many times when I was in the infantry and I knew take that, do this. And the back of my head was like, well, that doesn't make any sense. That's not the way to go about doing that. But I still did it because it felt more comfortable to me to go the other direction.
Yeah. And that basically how the brain works, right? It feels comfortable going quickly sometimes, especially under certain situations, because it wants to feel right. When it feels right, it feels safe.
And that sense of safety is ultimately what our instincts are trying to create all the time.
Yeah,
really,
our brains want to keep us alive, right? That's their main function. That's what they see as the primary thing they need to do, is to keep us alive. After that, it's really just to procreate, but they want to keep us alive, right? And so that's their main objective. And when they feel uncertain about anything, when they don't know what's going on, when they're confused, that's not a point of safety for the brains. Now we don't know what danger lurks inside the confusion, right? Inside the unknown. This is why we're scared of the dark. This is why we're scared of the unknown. This is why we're scared people resist change and new ideas, because it's all unknown. We don't know how safe we're going to be there. And so we have to move the brain out of that instinct, because it's fighting us from a survivalist perspective. But a new idea isn't usually a threat to our lives, right? It's just a threat to our belief system. Yeah. But the brain doesn't understand that distinction. It really hasn't evolved enough with modern times. We've only been, we're millions of years old as a species, right? But we're only been out of these immediate survival situations every day for a few thousand years, and the brain hasn't caught up to that yet.
And with the speed that information is given to us and fed to us, depending on where we're looking for it, it's going to be very biased, and that's going to affect how we're going to look at things as well, I think. Does that make sense at all?
Oh, hello there. It's Glenn, the voiceover artist. And if you're hearing me, that means we're at the midpoint of this episode. Do you have an idea for an episode that you feel is vital for emerging leaders? Leave the idea in the comments section, and if your topic is chosen, you will have the opportunity to join us as a co-host during the recording session. So, drop us a note and let's talk. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you, and if you feel we've earned it, please tell your friends and leave a review to help us grow our following. And now, back to the show.
Yeah, information is a fairly paltry commodity right now. Information used to be something that was magnificent because there was so little of it. And so if somebody who knew, years and years ago, a doctor could know just about everything there was to know about doctoring, right? Because there wasn't a lot of information about it. And some of it was crazy, but a doctor could learn just about all there was to know at the time. There's no doctor on earth now who can know even a fraction of all there is to know about doctoring in all the different fields and all the different research, even in one field, right? It's impossible to keep up with it all. Information used to be a wonderful commodity. And of course, we still need information. But what everyone's realizing is that we have all we used to think more information was the key to our success. We need more information. Then the information age hit and we realized, we have too much of it. We don't have people who can think about it. That's the real problem now. It's not getting the information. It's our capacity to think about the information.
That's huge. And when we talk about the ability to bring that information in, coincidentally, that's what this whole episode is about, is helping new leaders understand ways to be able to draw the information in, analyze it, and be able to move forward. So I am curious, before we get into offering some actual practical tools about that, do you have any ways that you might offer to emerging leaders to help them understand or maybe self-diagnose what type of critical thinking or critical thinker rather that they might be?
Well, the critical thinking is the same for everybody. Okay. It doesn't vary because all of our brains operate on the same fundamental mechanisms for critical thinking. So there aren't really different kinds of thinkers. There are people who will be affected differently by some different cognitive biases and so forth and things like that. And that's one of the things that everyone can start doing to become a better thinker, is that whenever you have to encounter a problem, a situation, take a moment to catalog for yourself where your biases are. And we all have biases. No one is free of biases. And they don't necessarily mean they're wrong, and they don't necessarily make us bad thinkers. But what was your upbringing? What's your worldview? What's your politics? What's your religion? What are all these things in your life? And how are they in some way influencing how you're looking at this problem? What are past similar problems that you looked at that are biasing the way you're looking at this next problem? Now, when I say biasing, in some ways, the biasing might be good. We might have learned from some of those previous problems and trying to apply it forward. In some ways, the biasing might be bad. Maybe you're biased because of how you solved problem number 3. Now you're on problem number 4, and you think it applies as much, and it doesn't, right? But that's where your brain wants to go. Just becoming self-aware, just listing them out for ourselves and becoming more cognizant of what our own biases are helps us to be more objective as we approach the subject matter. You're never going to be perfectly objective. Nobody is. And again, biases aren't necessarily a bad thing to have because we all have them. We can't help it. But know what they are and be aware of how they're influencing how you're approaching the given situation.
Well, thank you very much for that. I have a couple of different examples in my mind, but the one I'm going to use for myself that I experienced was back in 2012 or so. I was teaching basic training. I was a sergeant in the Canadian Air Force. And at that time, the students, when I first arrived to teach basic training, the students were not, or the candidates, sorry, were not permitted to have their cell phones after 1800, which is 6 o'clock at night. And the reasoning was not to punish anyone, but that they had so many things going on throughout the day that they had learned that they needed to study and prepare for the next day, that cell phone would just cause people to not work together. They'd sit in their little cubicles and just turn into turtles for the night. And that was the impression that we all got. But at the same token, basic training by its very nature is difficult. So people would be quitting and different things. And the forces is continuing to go through a personnel shortage. So the commandant was trying to come up with ways to entice people to stay and not necessarily make things easier for the candidates, but help them want to continue with a career. So the commandant came out and said candidates will be allowed to have their cell phones. There were certain regulations, of course, that came along with that. But the majority of us, especially, and I fall into this category now, the old guard with finger quotations, were like pounding on the table. The Canadian forces is about to implode. Things are going to explode. This building's going to burn to the ground. There's teamwork going to evaporate. And we were all losing our mind. But of course, what happened was the exact opposite happened. It turned out that, yes, there were some people that's what they did. They turtled in their corner and that was it. But the vast majority of people were now able to take a moment, take a breath, think about things, and actually work together, and actually quite often use their cell phones as a tool to help them succeed for the next day and whatnot. And I use that as an example, and for my mind, in that the commandant had the wherewithal to take a moment and think about these biases, push them aside, and think about the broader picture and how that might move forward. And we had to experience it and learn from there. So when I'm struggling with a bias, I use that example in my mind to say, okay, things are probably not going to be as bad as I think they are, and what are the possible outcomes, and maybe I need to be open to them.
Yeah, I think the more we can, one of the things we also tell people to do is, let's lay out what are potentially important factors to consider. I didn't say what are important factors to consider, because that's actually very different. If we lay out what are important factors to consider, we've already made a lot of judgments. We've already filtered a lot. And we've done that in very biased, instinctive ways, using usually the system one, the fast flawed system, right? If we lay out what are potentially important factors that could matter, we don't know if they matter yet or not. Well, now all of a sudden we're tricking our brains into doing something different, which is laying out a broader range of possibilities than we would consider otherwise. That's not hard to do, right? There's nobody who can't make the shift from laying out what they decide is important to what could potentially be important for a later discussion. That's easy. And the difference it makes in the caliber and quantity of information we're willing to consider at a given moment and how biased we are in approaching it is dramatic. So simple things like this, that if we know we can transform our thinking and transform our leadership, are so simple. And we just have to get people aware of them.
That's the thing with it. A lot of times it's so obvious that we don't even realize how obvious it is. and that's a challenge.
Yeah, it is. And here's the most ironic thing about it, right? So we teach people how to understand what their brain does when it thinks and how to start to govern that executive function so that they become better critical thinkers. They use their brains better, right? Literally, that's the idea. How do you use your brain better? People know how to use their bodies better in so many ways. We know how to use our bodies better if we want to become a runner, if we want to get built up, if we want to lose weight. We know all kinds of things we can do to use our bodies better. If we want to play tennis, we can go get coached and how do we use our body to be a tennis player and so forth, right? We can develop our bodies in that respect. How many people were told how to use their brains better? Isn't it weird? Isn't it odd? And the reason is that we didn't have the information until very recently. But nevertheless, isn't it odd that we learn all of these things about our bodies, and yet the biggest thing that we are is critical thinkers. And the thing that depends on our survival and our success most is our capacity to use our brains. But we're not taught how to use our brains the way we're taught how to use our bodies. That doesn't make any sense. Again, I mean, the problem has been the research wasn't there until recently to start to figure all this out. But nevertheless, it's kind of ironic, right? It's kind of weird if you think about it. The most important thing we need to know how to use is our brains. And that's where we get the least instruction as a species, as a society.
Well, it's interesting. And I think talking about biases, I think there had been a lot of preconceived biases that, this education system is the way that we're going to teach people to think. And that, therefore, is creating a critical thinker. And everyone said it, and someone with probably a whole bunch of education said it, so therefore that must be correct. But it's difficult to look outside those windows and outside those paths to understand that. It's interesting. I know for myself, when I started my master's degree, I did not have an undergraduate degree, and so when I applied for the degree program, they came back and said, "Hey, conditionally accepted. You need to do an advanced writing course." And I'm thinking, okay, well, this shouldn't be too big a deal. I'm an amazing military writer, and without tooting my own horn, I'm very good at writing with a military perspective, but that also is very practical and very pragmatic in how you're going to write things, and so going into the thing, I started writing these essays and papers, and it became very clear to me that just because in the world that I was my normal environment, I was a skilled writer, there was everything else outside there that I had no idea about, and I had to adjust. I had to think differently about how I was going to attack those different essays and stuff. And I carry that with me quite often to remind myself, okay, there's other things out there, and that's okay. And I think there's a big part of it because I struggled with that part at first. This is stupid. Why the hell, Sinky, am I doing this? Blah, blah, blah. Once I realized I could be open to those things, it made it a lot easier to be more open-minded to the different ways to look at things. And I think that's a big part of critical thinking, is having that openness.
It is. We call it intellectual humility is the official term for that. And it's the recognition that really that we don't know very much, no matter who you are, right? And what field you're in or what you're doing in your life. You don't know very much about it. Now, that doesn't mean there are not people with more expertise in some areas than others. And I think it's very important that on the whole, we really pay attention to what the experts say. The fact that we can go and do a Google search and read some articles for ourselves does not make us experts compared to the experts. And we have to heed and listen carefully to what experts tell us, not follow it blindly, but really have to, of course, really pay attention to it. But that said, for the most part, what we have to know is that in any given field, even the experts, the best experts will talk about all the things they don't know and how much more there is to understand than what they understand, right? That's really what led them to become experts, was their willingness to embrace how much they didn't know about the field instead of what they did know about the field. And that's intellectual humility. We have to all approach whatever we think as put our beliefs aside for a moment, put our understanding aside for a moment and say, wait a second, whatever I know, it's not enough. Even if I know more than this other person, maybe this other person has an insight that I don't have. So the quantity of my knowledge is bigger, but I don't have this missing piece to the puzzle that they might be able to offer me. Maybe not, but you don't know that until you put your beliefs aside and listen. And that's intellectual humility. Be small when you're in conversations. Know what you know, but first be humble about it and see what you can listen and hear and learn.
As you were talking about, I was thinking about the quote, "Slow is smooth, smooth is fast."
Yes.
There will be stumbles. As we're figuring these things out, we'll get there. The challenge is, and my impression of it is, the challenge is that information we spoke about earlier, it's so easy to go and find information, not necessarily the right information, but it's easy to find that information. So with that quote in mind, talking about emerging leaders, what type of tips might you have for help emerging leaders find, what tools would you have to help them be critical thinkers or think in a more critical sense?
Well, we've listed some already, some different tactics and so forth. I think the biggest one that I can talk about here, obviously, we can't go into a whole critical thinking process here, but I think the biggest one is be cognizant of one's own biases and so forth. And another one I'll give you is this. So the way our brains work is that we have a little part of our brain, a little tiny part of the brain, it's about 0.3% of our brain is an organ called the amygdala. And the amygdala is very, very powerful because we really have, it doesn't really work this way. We have two different brains. We have a limbic system brain, which is our reactive brain. Okay, this is our fight or flight response. This is our emotional responses. And then we have our frontal brain, our prefrontal cortexes. And that's where you do things that you really associate with thinking per se. Okay. Here's the problem. The amygdala is great because it was designed to keep us alive. So if bear jumps out, the amygdala springs into action and it has the power to decide which of our two brains is thinking. So it shuts off the thinking brain and it turns on the limbic brain and powers our body up to survive the bear attack, which means literally do physical things. So it increases our airways, okay? So we get more oxygen. It dilates our pupils, so we see more. It increases the blood flow and raises our heart rate and does all these things so that our bodies are better prepared to physically survive. Awesome. That's what we need when the bear attacks. That's good. Okay. Now time to sit down and write a poem about the bear attacking us. We got to, or write a paper about it. You got to do something. But what it also does in that moment is it actually powers down the thinking brain. It kind of shuts it off. It draws blood away from the thinking brain. It draws power away from the thinking brain because you don't need it in that moment. And it really has the ability to do this. The problem is that the amygdala sees cognitive threats, ideas, or stressful situations as the same thing as physical threats, and will tend to shut off the thinking parts of our brains. This is important for leaders, and it's also important for the people you lead, because as you start to increase stress upon them in certain ways, right? If you throw change at them, you have to understand their amygdalas are firing up, and the amygdala is therefore starting to divert power away from their thinking brains and towards their survival brains, which means they are thinking less and less about what you're telling them, and they're worrying more and more. Okay. And this happens even when people don't know it. You can say, hey, are you stressed out by this? They'll say, no, I'm fine. But what we know from other kinds of testing that's done physiologically and so forth is that actually their brains are starting to power down in terms of their thinking brains when any stress starts to come upon people. How do we deal with that? Individually and collectively, what you can do is, first of all, realize how you present things to people, that it's going to put stress on them. But the second thing is this. And this goes for leaders too, for the things that you're worried about in your leadership, decisions you have to make that might be stressful for you. Take a few minutes to put in your own words. You have to either say it out loud or you have to write it down. Write down the things that are stressing you out about it. Okay. And this is a way to trick your amygdala, because it does two things. And then not only write what's stressing you out about it, but make sure you take a few moments to write. This is very important. Take a few moments to write ways that you're going to succeed. What are your resources for success? What are things that are your assets for success? Now, this tricks your amygdala into doing a couple things. The first thing it does is, in order for you to use words, it has to activate your thinking brain. It's the only place words come from. So it's going to activate your thinking brain more and more as you use words. The second thing that it does is it starts to get reassured by the assets you have for your success. Okay. But it's not enough just to try to think of these things or just sit there and try to calm down. Actually vent it out. And there's research on this that shows just a few minutes of doing this makes a great difference in how well and how much power you have in your thinking brain to go on and think about the thing that you're doing. And you can ask people on your team to do the same thing. Just write down a few concerns you have about this project we're about to embark on, or whatever it's going to be. And you'll also achieve success that way. So that's another quick tip for how we can start thinking better as leaders.
I really appreciate that. I love the idea of you're telling ways to tell your brain to slow down, write this stuff out, and force someone to do something. It seems to me that might make someone feel uncomfortable and feeling, because the brain is trying to pressure and go, go, go. But take that time, force it to happen. I think a common theme I hear often for pretty much everything when it comes to any type of leadership is things will generally not happen as quickly as you'd like them to happen. Take a second. There's always a time to take a second. There always, always, always is.
Right.
And just take a moment to process.
Yeah. Why not? What are we losing by it, if nothing else? Right. It's only a gain. It's only a win. It takes a couple minutes, so it's only a win situation. There's no harm that's going to come from that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you in that. This has been, we've talked a lot about a whole bunch of different things, and I've really enjoyed this. I am curious, what final thoughts might you have?
I think, again, I want to impress upon emerging leaders that there's nothing that's going to make a bigger difference in their success or failure as a leader, and how you're viewed as a leader, and how the people in your organization succeed and the people under your leadership succeed, then not just how well you think and understand what thinking is and understand the thinking process and so on, but how well you can get them to do it and make them feel comfortable in that process. Take the time to think about how you can best be intellectually humble, how you can best let other people's thinking flourish and feel comfortable and safe to express other ideas. The safety is so important, right? As soon as it's contentious, people won't feel safe anymore. How can we make sure everyone on our teams feels safe to do things and take risks intellectually and say things that are different. And they'll value you for it if they have that safety. We know that from research on leadership. The first thing, whether they know it or not, one of the first things people want, and the thing that people often don't feel, is safe intellectually. So create that room for safety, value difference, value different ideas, value divergence, right? As a team leader, and don't do it in a way that is just a facade, right? If you say, well, I've got this idea for what we should do. I want to hear everyone else's idea. And then you hear everyone else's idea and you go, that's great. Thanks so much. We're going to go do my idea now. Then you've just proven to everyone that you really don't care about their ideas. They're really not safe to voice them. And you undermine your leadership for the rest of the time you're going to be working with that team unless you start to make really major corrections, right? So you can change that course, but it's harder that, once you set that precedent. So think about ways you can always make people feel safe and make their ideas not feel valued, but be genuinely valued. And that means that you have to show how it changes your thinking. And if you can show that your team changes your thinking, then they will feel safe and they will feel valued.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I love the idea of intellectual safety in a team and creating an environment where that's an actual thing. In your example, I think very likely almost everyone has experienced that at some point in time. And you can almost tell when the supervisor or someone okay, I know I need to ask what everyone thinks. And you can see their eyes kind of go up in the top left corner of their head and they're already deciding or thinking about how they're going to enact their plan.
Right. What can I say that's going to make you think I'm saying something that's responding to your question, but really is blowing smoke or what have you, or saying the thing you want to hear, right? And that's not what we want good teams to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I love it. Thanks so much for that. No trouble at all. Well, listen, Steve, before we sign off, if people want to hear more from you, they want to take advantage of the Critical Thinking Institute, how might they be able to do that?
Yeah, please come to the Critical Thinking Institute. If anything that I'm saying here seems to make sense to you, come to the Critical Thinking Institute at thectinstitute.com. We have programs available. If you're obviously an emerging leader and so forth, we have our Critical Thinking Mastery program that will take you through our whole process of learning how to operate your brain better, to think better. And you can do the same thing for your team, of course, but it will really be a great asset to you for the rest of your life. And if you're a parent, we also have Brighter Minds, Better Futures, which is our program for kids and families. And you get to watch some animated characters do some of the same stuff. Both programs really go through the same curriculum because all brains operate the same way. Kids' brains and adult brains really operate the same way. And we're just explaining it differently through some different mechanisms for different groups. But come to the Critical Thinking Institute, thectinstitute.com, see the programs we have. If you've spent thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars on education, we're talking about under $1 a day to be able to have authentic critical thinking skills and a better understanding of how to operate your own brain. I think it's a pretty good bargain, but it was really so important to me, and is, that we make this something that's affordable for everyone. I don't think that only rich people should be able to have good critical thinking skills. So we really was very important to us that we kept it at a very humble price point.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for all of that, for this great conversation, to help others understand the value and the importance of critical thinking. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's been great.
Right on. Take care. Well, that's a wrap from the front. In this episode, we talked about critical thinking. We talked about the importance of creating an intellectually safe space for yourself and for your team. We talked about this is important because we need to know how we can succeed. We need to know our stressors. And we need to understand that our biases will affect everything that we're going to do when we're thinking about everything. Thanks for tuning in. And remember, leadership without passion limits the depth of your vision.
Never miss an episode by following us on all of your favorite feeds. While you're there, please consider leaving an episode review and let us know what topics you would like to hear about. Be sure to join us next week with your host, Simon Cardinal, for another episode of Trench Leadership, a podcast from the front, produced by iGlen Studios, music provided by Ashamal of Music.